just for a little bit here quickly, and talk a little bit about the role of language in self-regulation, especially in toddlers, but also other older kids too. So the reason this became kind of a topic of interest was I went back through some of my old posts and I updated a post that was about language and self-regulation in toddler boys. And so I'll post that. If you didn't see it on my main page, I can post that. And a lot of people really reacted to it on Facebook, and I've got a lot of interest in it. So I thought, oh, maybe I should talk about this more. So, and I think it's a topic that a lot of people are interested in because a lot of us struggle in those toddler years to help our kids with self-regulation. And that is one of the key components to getting past the tantrums and the whining, is to help them learn self-regulation. So I think it's a hot topic for a lot of people, especially if you have toddlers, but older kids as well. Okay, so the study was looking at toddlers, boys and girls, and the role that language, their vocabulary, had in how well they could self-regulate. And what they found was, so generally speaking, this is sort of stereotypical, but it is a true scientific finding that young girls, toddlers, girls tend to develop self-regulation a little bit sooner than boys. And if you have a boy and you have been at a play date with your like 2 or 3-year-old, you can tell this usually. But it's not just a stereotype. There's some truth behind it. And what we think some of the reason for that is this language skill piece. Girls a lot of times do pick up language a little bit sooner, and I'm not sure completely the reasoning for that. I would have to go look up the research on that. But so the language piece is a huge part of the self-regulation part. And so typically girls have picked that up sooner, and so they self-regulate a little bit better at young ages. However, what the study showed was boys, toddler boys who had better language skills than average, more vocabulary, that type of thing, were able to self-regulate just as well as girls. So this gives a lot of insight into how self-regulation develops in those early years and the role that language plays, and it's huge. And so this made me think of the sort of old standard phrase that parents have been using for generations, which is use your words. You know, when your toddler is whining for something or grunting and pointing, you know, that stage, a lot of times you'll hear parents say, use your words, use your words. And really, that is what you need to do. I mean, it sounds kind of silly, and sometimes those standard phrases that parents use aren't really that helpful, but in this case, it sort of is. Now, you have to do a little more modeling than just saying use your words. You sometimes have to give them the words to use. So if they're very young and they don't have much vocabulary, it is sometimes helpful to rephrase or give them ideas of things to say so they can learn the words that they need to use. So if your toddler is, you know, in the kitchen pointing and grunting at the refrigerator or the juice container or whatever it is, you can offer them suggestions of things to say, you know, juice please, or milk please, and they start to pick up on what they're supposed to say and the vocabulary they can use instead of grunting and whining, right? And so that is how that whole language piece plays into that. The other example I thought of was from when my own kids were little, and I talk about this in the article, is language is not only helping them communicate to the person they're talking to, but it's also self-talk. And so I remember when my son was, you know, 18 months or 2 years old or so, we had been talking with him when he would go something near something that we didn't want him to touch, you know, we'd say, no, or don't touch that, the trash can or the toilet or something like that, that we didn't want him to get into. And over time, as he picked up more language, when he would go to that trash can or whatever it was, he would say to himself, no. And so you can see right there, that is really crucial in how kids develop self-regulation, because that language becomes their own self-talk and they're telling themselves, don't touch that. And it just develops over and over in more advanced ways as they get older. And so that piece of research, I think, was very useful for parents, you know, that we can foster that through the use of language. And it's a very simple, straightforward thing that we can do with our youngsters when they're just learning words to help foster that vocabulary so that they have the words to use to self-regulate. And I wanted to read this real quick quote that was in the article because I thought it was so good. I don't know if any of you have heard of Ellen Galinsky. She's an author who wrote this book called Mind in the Making. This was a few years ago. It's a great book, but she taught, the whole book is about executive function skills, which self-regulation is a part of that. And so getting back to like, why do we care about self-regulation? Of course, we care about it in daily life because we don't want our kids to run out in the street, or we want them to, when we tell them not to do something, hopefully obey or, you know, learn to regulate their emotions. That's a key part of it. But also, what is the bigger picture here with executive function? And this is what she talks about in the book. Focus and self-control involve many executive functions of the brain, such as paying attention, remembering the rules, and inhibiting one's initial response to achieve a larger goal. So inhibiting your initial desire to run out in the street or whatever it is, and having enough self-regulation to moderate that. She goes on to say, many scientists now believe that executive functions, such as self-regulation and all those things, paying attention, predict children's success as well as, if not better than, IQ tests. And so to me, that points to this larger idea. Why do we want our kids to learn self-regulation? Why is it important? And this is why, because these skills will follow them their whole life and help them throughout the years as they grow up in all the things that they do, academics and career and all those things. So one of the things I wanted to bring up with this was, this is not really just in toddlers. This goes for older kids as well. So once they get older, they have the vocabulary to self-regulate better, but the use of language and helping them do that is can still be really helpful. So, you know, if you've ever talked to yourself when you are in a bad mood, or you have a big test or a big project at work coming up and you kind of walk through it in your head, or you have some sort of mantra that you say when you get nervous or anxious about something, that's the same process that's at play here, is this self-talk as a form of self-regulation. And so I think if we can use that as an example for our kids as they grow up, because a lot of times you'll hear kids as they get into elementary school, if they're not great at some new skill or they're still learning something and it's a struggle for them, you'll hear them talk bad about themselves and use that negative self-talk. I'm just horrible at this. I'm never going to be good at this. And I've heard my own kids say that. And so I've had to really be mindful of that and listen for that when they're struggling with something, so that I can kind of intervene a little bit and kind of give them other options for how to talk to themselves about it. Because that, you know, that voice that you give yourself and the way their kids talk about themselves can really become their internal voice. And so helping them understand that that is a powerful message. How you talk to yourself can really impact, you know, how you think about your skill and your self-confidence. And so I think that is helpful to think about, that this language piece of self-regulation continues on as they get older. And then finally, one other part, even in adults, I was just listening to a podcast the other day about language and how adults cope with stressful things that happen in our lives. And there's this really cool line of research that, and I've seen this professor give a talk a few times. He's in Austin, where I used to be, and his name's Jamie Pennebaker. If you've ever read any of his stuff, I'll post a link to some of his work. But he talks a lot about the role of language and how people cope with stress. And really, he talks about a lot of things that are very stressful, like the loss of a loved one or chronic illness, things like that. But what he talks about is the way people talk about the event or the person that they lost or the thing that happened to them changes over time. And when the way that they talk about it changes, that has shown to be part of the coping mechanism. And so what he has looked at is kind of what we would describe as expressive writing, and helping people cope with stress and trauma. And so when people first start working through something that was traumatic or stressful, they often use a lot of I, and it's all focused on themselves. I did this, I experienced this, I went through this, and that's a normal stage. But as they progress through the coping process and dealing with this traumatic event, and they start to make sense of it and make meaning of it, their use of those words change. And so it becomes more balanced between just saying I and other pronouns like we, he. So it turns the focus on the other people in the scenario and the other person. And I can, like I said, I'll post some a link that goes into more depth about this. But the point I wanted to make was that the use of language and how people self-regulate goes through the whole lifespan. And so as we think about this with toddlers, it's very easy to see how it plays out when toddlers and using their words, but how we talk to ourselves and how our children can, learn to use language as a form of self-regulation is really important. And it's fascinating research, and I think it's something that we can really apply to our daily lives and the lives of our kids. So I hope you guys found that helpful. If you have questions, feel free to post those after. I know a lot of people can't come on live, and you watch this later. So if you have questions, I try to keep an eye on who's posting, and I try to respond as best I can. And I hope you have a good Thursday. Stay warm, and see you next time.